Good morning, and today we're going to talk about the American women's suffrage movement. Now, we're going to start off with a quote from the historian Victoria Bissell Brown, who said, tend to think of suffrage as an on-off switch. Women didn't have the vote, and then women did have the vote in 1920, but the story is actually quite different. So what does the word suffrage mean? If you have suffrage, it means you are enfranchised. You have the right to vote in an election. When we first look at America having the right to vote, in the early 1800s, many women were involved in abolition or anti-slavery movements and in the temperance, no alcohol movements. So even back in the very beginnings of our country, women were very much in the forefront of politics. So in 1848, when they decide to start talking about women having the right to vote in the United States, they have their first convention about the women's suffrage movement in Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848. So a group of women and men gathered at a conference hall in Seneca Falls, New York, and this conference was led by two women by the name of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. And here we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Her home nowadays is a museum. And we talk about what they did in 1848. They took the idea of the Declaration of Independence and they actually kind of retooled it and rewrote it into what is called the Declaration of Sentiments. So we ask, why are women requesting to vote? Well, they wrote, we hold these truths that be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of those who suffer from it to refuse allegiance or loyalty to it, and to insist upon the institution of a new government. Now, the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, which means to take away power, on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. So in the Declaration of Sentiments, they rebranded the Declaration of Independence by taking a lot of the ideas of freedom and the ideas of how we have our own rights, their inalienable rights, and now we're putting it not just on the idea of man, but on men and women as genders. And also part of the Declaration of Independence, instead of talking about King George III and the wrongs that he had done towards the United States in order to cause the American Revolution, now they're taking in the Declaration of Sentiments the idea of he as a gender. What has man done to woman? He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise or the right to vote. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she has had no voice. He becomes in marriage, for all intents and purposes, her master, the law giving him power to deprive her of her liberty and to administer punishment. He closes against her all the avenues to wealth and distinction which he considers most honorable to himself. As a teacher of religion, medicine, or law, she is not known. He has given to the world a different code of morals for men and women, by which moral delinquencies or crimes which exclude women from society are not only tolerated, but deemed of insignificance in man. He has endeavored, in every way that he could, to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. Now, in view of this entire disfranchisement of one half of the people of this country, in view of the unjust laws above mentioned, and because women do feel themselves aggrieved, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of their most sacred rights, we insist that they have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States. And once again, this is the Declaration of Sentiments, written in 1848 by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So when we think about the rights of suffrage for women, we also have to look at the suffrage for others in the United States. Now, for example, after the American Civil War, we passed the 14th Amendment in 1868, and that is chiefly for the idea of, regardless of color or race, you as an American should have the right to all parts of citizenship, which would include suffrage, which would include voting. So in the 14th Amendment in Section 1, it talks about citizenship. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, when we take into that effect in 1868 the 14th Amendment, Susan B. Anthony considers all persons to be all persons, male and female. And so now, especially that we have that 14th Amendment, she decided to go and vote with the Constitution in hand, and she is summarily arrested. And there's a trial in Canandaigua, New York, because she as a woman tried to vote by saying in the 14th Amendment it says, I am a person in the United States, and therefore I have my rights. So at the trial, a judge instructed the jury to find her guilty without discussion. He fined her $100 and made her pay the courtroom fees, but he didn't imprison her when she refused to pay, therefore denying her the chance to appeal. So she wanted to make a huge referendum about it. She wanted the public to know, she wanted the press to know that she tried to vote and she refuses to pay her fees, and the trial judge is trying to make everything nice and quiet and just kind of push it away. When she refuses to pay her $100, he won't put her in jail, therefore denying her the chance to appeal by saying, I have a right to vote. Now in 1869, Frederick Douglass, now as a Black American, has the right to vote because he is male, but he also decides to start taking the side of all people. Male and female should have the right to vote. And he wrote, when women, because they are women, are dragged from their houses and hung upon lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed upon the pavement, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own. Is this not true for Black women? Yes, yes, and yes. It is true for the Black woman, but not because she is a woman, but because she is Black. So when we look at Sojourner Truth in 1869, she also writes, there's a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about the colored woman. And if colored men get their rights and not colored women theirs, you will see the colored men will be masters over the women, and it will be just as bad as it was before. So despite Frederick Douglass saying that it is nice to have equal rights, it's also going to disappoint many women who thought the African American men and women would then be enfranchised together. With the 15th Amendment coming along in 1870, that extends the right to vote. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So in our 1870 15th Amendment, we established the right to vote. So once again, you're going to imagine we have the Suffrage Association believing now they have the right to vote. So before 1910, we're going to see Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton now deciding we have this amendment, we're going to fight for it. And so they create NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Their strategy, instead of just attacking, piecemeal, how do we get the right to vote, say in New York or in the United States itself, they're going to try and win suffrage state by state. They would love to pass a constitutional amendment, but that would need 3/4 of the states in order to sign that in. That's a lot, especially in the 1800s. So they've decided to get all of the nation's women together, and they're going to start going state by state to win suffrage. Now, when you look at a map of women's suffrage before 1920, Amazingly, most of the women who have suffrage are going to be out in the West, where you have new states who are creating their laws from scratch. So if you take a look, say, for example, at Wyoming, they're going to be our first state giving women the right to vote in 1869. So we have partial women's suffrage in the Midwest, as they are still continuing to create their laws. Even though they came in the mid-1800s, they're going to give their women partial suffrage, that depending upon which county you're in or which town or city you're in, some places women have the right and some places they do not. Where women have absolutely no suffrage are usually across the American South and the American East, where you have the oldest population, the oldest colonization, and therefore it's more difficult for them to get their suffrage because the laws are not being written today. Now, unfortunately, Elizabeth Cady Stanton dies in 1902, and Susan B. Anthony dies in 1906. They would not see an entire United States pass an amendment for women's rights to vote, so they had fought with their entire lives, and now the next generation has to take over. So in the early 1900s, in the second generation of women suffragettes, you see many young middle-class women are going to college, and those college-educated women are starting to become leaders of the suffrage movement. They hoped the vote would help improve working conditions of women. Most women at this time were probably working as servants in homes, or they were working in industries as lower class mill workers and such. And so they were hoping this would improve working conditions because the women would have the right to say what is going on in their communities. So our new era of progressive era suffragists, you're going to see Lucy Burns, Carrie Catman Chatt, and Alice Paul take up the reins for the second generation of American suffragettes. Starting with Carrie Catman Chatt, she's going to be head of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She's the one who's going to push that state-by-state strategy, where we start off in the West with their new laws and start bringing it back to the East. She supports President Wilson in the 19-teens, even though he didn't outright support suffrage, because Democrats at the time were a safer bet than Republicans. Most of the states out west were led by Democrats at the time, and so she found it an easier time to get them to pass suffrage laws for women. And so she was at least going to support President Wilson because she thought at least she'd have an ear in the White House. She also, unlike other suffragettes, are going to be acting what they'd consider to be more ladylike. She doesn't want to embarrass the movement. She's looking at long-term goals, and so therefore she's going to go more towards policy and laws and not more towards the press. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns are going to lead the NWP, and they believed in more aggressive, perhaps not ladylike strategies. They did not want to do a state-by-state process. They figured they wanted a constitutional amendment, and they wanted it now. And they're going to adopt these strategies from British suffragettes, such as heckling politicians, picketing, even showing up at the politicians' homes. They refused to support President Wilson if he wouldn't outright support women's suffrage. And NWP members were arrested for picketing in front of the White House constantly. Now, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns would find themselves in and out of jail. They would go on hunger strikes, sometimes even being force-fed. Now, the National Women's Party that they led created their own flag to symbolize their struggles to achieve women's suffrage. Now, during their drive to ratify the 19th Amendment, the amendment which would give the women the right to vote, they would sew on a star of the flag for each state that ratified that amendment. They used the flag when picketing the White House, which was unheard of at that time. They also used it during their parades and demonstrations. When the 19th Amendment was finally ratified in 1920, the leader of the party, Alice Paul, unfurled a flag with stars representing all of the states at their national headquarters in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for stopping by to learn more about the American women's right to vote. If you'd like to learn more about suffragettes, say perhaps over in Great Britain and in other countries, please leave a comment down below. Let me know what else you'd like to learn about when it comes to suffragettes. And as always, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. Thanks for stopping by.